folks who are in the room and to our live stream audience for joining us today. I have the great honor of moderating this panel today. My name is Robert Jones. I work with the Cellular Agriculture Alliance, but I have a deep personal passion for the topic today. I worked for years in sustainable fisheries management. I'm an avid scuba diver and love the ocean and aquatic food, so it's really excited to be here and have this conversation today, which we've, as you can see, is how diversification of aquatic food consumption can help address biodiversity. Seafood is increasingly recognized for its key role in food security and nutrition, and overall contributes more than 17% of the animal protein globally. Per the most recent UN State of the World Fisheries and Aquaculture report, global consumption of seafood has more than doubled in the last 50 years and is on track to double again by 2050, which puts significant additional pressure on aquatic resources. And for the purposes of this conversation, we want to expand our lens beyond just seafood and traditional seafood and make sure to include the full range of aquatic foods from both marine, fresh, and brackish environments. Aquaculture has helped keep pace with this growing demand for aquatic food, up to date supplying almost half of the world's fish, crustaceans, and mollusks, but alone cannot solve the demand conundrum that we face, especially in the face of the climate crisis. And these aquatic resources are not, they are dynamic and they're changing with the climate crisis as well, which is impacting production systems. So the centerpiece of the discussion today is whether a strategy of diversifying aquatic food consumption patterns to include a range of sustainable wild-caught species, farm-raised, plant-based, cell-cultured seafood, and a hybrid of some of these could help reduce pressure on high-demand species in order to help build more resilience to the trifecta of crises that we face in climate change, food security, and biodiversity loss. And to have this important conversation today, we have with us a distinguished panel of experts that I'll introduce as we ask the first questions. I want to start with Dr. Tikular, who is with the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions and is the primary author of what's called the Blue Foods Assessment, which I've read for years. Michelle, if you can start with sort of a landscape analysis for us for what's happening on the water, and provide us with some data about how these critical marine resources are being impacted by the climate crisis.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Robert, for inviting me to join this panel. It's really a pleasure to be here. I don't very often get to talk to people on the industry side of things and hear about all the recent innovations. So it's a really exciting conversation to be a part of. Small correction, I'm not the primary author of the Blue Food Assessment. This was actually a collaboration between many institutions and scientists who together mapped out how what we call blue food, so fisheries and aquaculture from marine, brackish, and freshwater environments, how they contribute to global food systems. And as part of that work, we mapped out how are blue foods impacted by different climate drivers. And I think it's really important to be thinking about the specific ways in which climate impacts our water food systems in particular, as they are quite different from what is happening in our terrestrial ecosystems, where we most typically just think about water and heat. So in the ocean, we're seeing that as a result of warming and changing ocean currents and deoxygenation, we see that fish species are declining in productivity and they're also on the move. So they're changing their geographies, they're moving northward mostly, and this is posing big challenges for fisheries management as fish pass in the waters of new jurisdictions. We also see another unique threat being ocean acidification, which is primarily impacting coral reef ecosystems as well as shellfish production. And then on the water, we're also seeing growing storm events as an increasing threat to fisheries and fishery safety. Of course, almost half of fish now come from aquaculture, and so they also have their unique set of challenges, mostly related to growing water temperatures, changes in fresh water availability, but also changing pests and pathogens as water temperatures rise. And this might have implications around antibiotic use and other elements of more food safety and water pollution. But another element I wanted to highlight really from the Blue Food Assessment work is where we look at the environmental footprint that aquatic foods, the environmental footprint that is associated with aquatic food. So we mapped out how amongst the vast diversity of aquatic food species, what is their carbon footprint, what is their land and water footprint, what is their nutrient pollution footprint. And on average, we find that the carbon footprint of aquatic foods is equivalent to or lower than that of chicken, which is the most efficient terrestrial animal source food. But there's huge diversity here. We see that certain species have really high carbon footprints, farmed shrimp or bottom-trawled fish like flounders. And others have really high potential for low carbon emissions. So we see bivalves or seaweed production can be extremely sustainable. And one final thing that I wanted to highlight is that it's really important to not just think about carbon, but all the other ways in which food production impacts our ecosystems. And so for fisheries and aquaculture, that's really around implications for biodiversity, overfishing. And so as we consider these alternative aquatic foods, it's really important, I think, to weigh what are the implications not only for our carbon footprint or for climate resilience, but what does this mean for biodiversity, but also what does it mean for nutrition, and I'm sure Shakuntala will talk about that more, and what does it mean for the livelihoods that these systems support. So globally, billions of people, or I'd say hundreds of millions of people, have livelihoods that depend on aquatic foods. And so as we are considering these alternative sources of protein, what does that mean for who is producing those things, and what does that mean for the sort of traditional livelihoods that are tied to these foods? So those were just a few science highlights I wanted to bring.
Yeah, thank you. Incredibly interesting and a great transition. Dr. Shakuntala Tilsted is the director of the CGIAR Nutrition, Health, and Food Security Impact Area Platform, and is also the 2021 World Food Prize winner. I'm honored to have you here today. Michelle has laid out some sort of sobering statistics on what's happening with these marine ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, and particularly the social impact of these fishing communities. I'm wondering if you can pick up from there and tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of impact to small-scale fishers and fishing communities, in particular in the global south, which oftentimes gets forgotten in these conversations.
Thank you so much, Robert. And Michelle began by talking about the diversity of the systems and also the diversity of the impacts that we are seeing. If we look at small-scale fishers, I would like to begin with the diversity of small-scale fishers, the diversity of their geographies, and the diversity of their livelihoods, the impacts and the benefits that you get from fisheries to these communities and population groups. And in talking about the population groups, I think it's extremely important to take into consideration that the group of the population, the women in the aquatic food systems. Michelle talked about the hundreds of millions. The figure that we use is that in the aquatic food systems, over 800 million people are engaged, of which 50% are women. And this is extremely important in talking about the impacts, especially the importance with respect to food and nutrition, because women are directly related to the foods that are prepared in the homes and the nutrition of their family members, especially young children. So if I would just focus on the benefits for nutrition and health, we do know that the diverse aquatic foods, especially low trophic species such as seaweed, small fish species, mollusks, are extremely important, not only as a source of protein. And when I talk about the nutritional value, it's not protein that I would put forward as the first nutrient. I would talk about the essential micronutrients, minerals and vitamins because of their importance to health and nutrition, and also because the forms in which they are found in aquatic foods are very highly bioavailable compared to the forms that are found in plant source foods. So that's an extremely important point. And also the concentrations, the high concentrations of essential fatty acids that are found in diverse aquatic foods, especially the low trophic species, and which are extremely important for cognition, for brain development, and thereby for national development, because you're talking about the population groups and young children as they go through their life cycles. Just there's evidence to show of the effect of having a well-nourished child and the effect of on school performance compared to not being well nourished, and the effect on school performance. Michel, so that's about nutrition and health. And then Michel mentioned about the effects on livelihoods. We know that just take large ocean states in the Pacific and the Caribbean, where I come from, the livelihoods of many, not just in production and in fishing, but in the supply chains, in the marketing, and all the way through to consumption, that has a large effect on the benefits and impacts of communities. And therefore, it is so very important that we don't have a solution that we have multiple solutions for multiple population groups and multiple parts of the population. We heard about the effects of changing changing temperatures in water. Water's getting warmer, and therefore these fish species moving further away from coastal communities, and thereby having an effect both on food and nutrition, but also on livelihoods and income of the populations by the movement of these fish species. So we must look at the solutions that we put in place that affects the multiple benefits of small-scale fisheries. And I do think it's important that we engage with communities from the very beginning and learn about their experiences, and from their traditional knowledge and practices, that perhaps we can find ways in which to move forward with respect to climate change. This we see, for example, if you talk to population groups, the groups that live in the mangroves, for example, in Indonesia, they have their own ways of management and knowledge and deep insights into how they can manage mangrove systems, and also how they try to get solutions that fit changes that are taking place. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
It's a really interesting point. I mean, some of those are the harshest environments, and if you've learned to navigate them and make them productive, you have a lot to teach us. That's a really interesting point. I want to come back to a few things that you hit on, but I want to go to Carrie next. Carrie, you are an entrepreneur. You're the founder and CEO of Avant Seafood, a company that's making cultivated fish. I'm wondering, and you're coming at this from a completely different point of view. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about mitigation and adaptation to what's happening in wild-caught and farm species, but you're actually bringing new fish from a new source to the table. Can you tell us a little bit about the process you're using to make your product and why you're doing what you're doing?
Thank you. Very pleased to be here to meet with all of you. I think starting with an extension of the point actually mentioned by the two panelists, is that the climate actually has a lot of impact on the food supply and in terms of the aquatic food. And I think we may not be very aware, but actually fish and seafood is the only kind of meat type we still rely on heavily catching them from the wild. We would not imagine catching chicken and like pork and from the wild, but fish simply that we still can. We're relying heavily on that. Aquaculture is offering a very, taking half of the demand, but as we know, aquaculture has the challenges now, as well as domesticating fish species is not, is a very lengthy time consuming process as well. So how we see is that cellular agriculture offer a third way of producing aquatic protein. So it basically relying on the cell biology processes. Our process take the cells from the animal, in this case a fish, and then let them adapt to growing outside of animal bodies, and then we can actually produce the same cell identical, biologically identical muscle cells, fat cell tissues in a more kind of like animal independent manner. So animal independence is actually very important in this case because it's more climate resilient and because we don't have it exposed, the production does not expose to the external weather. It can happen in very traditional food factory. Indeed, actually the factory kind of looked like a brewery as well as a yogurt making facility as well. So I think this is the benefit of that. In addition, this method also would not incur land use change. As we know, fish like water-based fish farm or those land-based will also take up some of the land use change as well. So that's contributing to that. Finally, in this case, because we can actually produce the food very close to where they are consumed. So we do not need to have a big fish farm or like catch from the ocean and then process them and then put them in the cold chain in order to be distributed to around the world, which, by the way, actually a very big carbon footprint. And in the middle, when there are wastage, they will also have a lot of food waste. Here, this method, we can actually have the facility in the city or the town where the demand is there, and then we can actually shorten the supply chain. So I think there's a lot of benefit and very interesting thing that this new technology can contribute to the alternative sort of aquatic proteins as a solution.
Just a quick follow-up. Can you give us a sense of what types of aquatic seafood might be able to be produced with this technology?
Well, the scientific principle work with most species, and I think fish, definitely different species of fish. There are different kind of seafood as well, those like crustacean. I think we're starting to see a company working on that, but those are less studied in terms of the scientific kind of research. So we'll see how quickly that come into the picture, but fish as well as crustacean is definitely very viable.
Great, thanks. I was just wanted to get a sense of what the scope could be in terms of the discussion about alternatives today. We'll come back to a few of these topics. I want to go to our last panelist, Kim Anders Odner, who is the managing director of Unovus Asset Partners Limited in over Europe and Asia. You have decades of experience as an investor. As I understand it, you also have some roots in conventional agriculture and aquaculture and some experience there, but you're now focused on investing in a different kind of portfolio. Can you tell us a little bit about, from your perspective of looking at where you can make social impact by moving capital around, what your sort of thesis is for change?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a really interesting panel, and it touches on so many important issues that really, unfortunately, we don't have an adequate lens to address. One of the challenges of being in the venture capital space is trying to align our sources of capital and our stakeholders' interests with those of the companies that we're trying to fund. And as I hear all of these really important aspects of aquaculture and the process of fishing and how that relates to the communities that undertake these activities. Unfortunately, we really only address a fairly narrow portion of that, and it's that which has a sort of a market solution that can help to improve the demand or the supply of fish or fish-like products for consumers using mechanized technology. So kind of what Carrie's involved with, we co-founded a company called Blue Nalu, and Blue Nalu is also doing cultured fish using cellular agriculture. And we've invested a lot in companies that do plant-based foods to try and create alternatives. And the thing that I wanted to focus on was this idea that through the market mechanisms, I think the best that we can do is focus on the things where we can help to alleviate the pressure on the demand for fish. And the two areas that I think are most addressable by our techniques would be ingredients, where fish serves as an ingredient. It could potentially be replaced with something like a plant-based alternative. And similarly, in the case of cultured solutions, where cultured solutions don't require structure and where they can be readily grown in a bioreactor in such a way that they can serve as an ingredient, where they don't need to have the kind of structure that fish typically has, that people look for in a center-of-the-plate solution. I think those are areas where we can potentially make a difference, or in very, very high-value applications, as in the case of something like tuna, or some other varieties of fish that are fairly rare and quite expensive. My roots, I started my professional career in Southeast Asia. I was working in Vietnam, where I sat on the board of a seafood processing company. And I also sat on the board of a company that was doing animal feed. And that feed was used for both aquaculture and also for pork. And one of the things that for me has been very, very defining is witnessing the establishment of one of the first commercial abattoirs in Vietnam, and see that literally move from a market where commercial pork production was nascent to one where the country is now the #1 pork producing or consuming country in the world. So in a short period of, let's say, 15 years, it's moved from having essentially a nascent market to one where it is actually the most intensive in the world. So you can see that the change, whether it's in seafood, the impact of those small communities that live along the sea that previously were fishing for agrarian and community purposes, they're now producing for a very high demanding market for fresh seafood. So I mean, the impact is profound, and it's happening at a very, very rapid rate.
Thanks for that. I have a few questions I want to ask, but I also want to make sure we open it up at this point and engage the audience as well. And I believe you're able to ask in the chat on the live stream and YouTube as well, if you have questions. So let me see if anyone in here has anything they want to ask. Yep, you, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Islam. I'm a nutritionist. I'm the founder of Sustainable Nutrition Academy. I was delighted I came slightly late, I miss you, but to hear the development and the success of your stories. I was wondering, how would you consider an increase in investment in mollusks with regards to not only their content in proteins, their access to micronutrients like omegas from the plants, but also and mainly for their features related to the shells. They're made of calcium carbonate, and if you complement that with more algae, you can capture even more carbon dioxide. I work in London. I'm promoting oyster restoration initiatives. The idea is that oysters also filter the water, so you are going to have not only an opportunity to reduce the acidity in the water, therefore affecting the biodiversity and improving the quality of the water, which is clearer, but you also can help local fishermen in slowing down the overfishing process by giving them an opportunity to stay resilient and allowing the small fish to grow by actually giving them a plan B locally that can empower them and give them opportunity to not sacrifice the small fish and therefore reduce the future opportunities, but you give them a plan B. So I give you another ways to make revenues. Would that be something appealing? So in addition to that, the calcium carbonate from the shells can be used after harvest for things that go from construction, packaging solution, food supplement. You can tackle rickets or osteoporosis and more opportunities.
Yeah.
Would that seem appealing?
See this calls into question, or creates, sort of frames the challenge that we face in line with kind of the earlier conversations. What would make that attractive is its scalability from a commercial funding perspective, right? So the larger the scale, the larger the impact. So the question is whether or not that impact is deleterious to the environment, or whether it's one that integrates nicely with the environment. And if it remains relatively small and not so impactful, the question then becomes, is it investable? And these are the changes, these are the challenging dynamics that we face from a funding perspective.
One oyster filters 200 liters of water every day. Imagine a proper farming opportunity. So for the environment, it's a win-win.
Yeah.
For the population and for the nutrition, it's a win-win. You're going to have more streams. So eventually, maybe it's not going to be extremely fast.
Yeah.
But in the long term, everywhere will be benefiting. So
Could I maybe add a little bit to that also?
Reactions we have. I want to unpack a couple of concepts in there. But go ahead.
Yeah, the main thing that I wanted to add is that one, bivalves can do a lot of amazing things, as you say, filter water, provide structure to the environment for other things to grow. They are extremely nutrient rich, not just protein, but all sorts of nutrients. And as you say, there's lots of interesting byproducts that can be generated. I think, and this is mostly anecdotal, but a lot of the issue around bivalves has been really finding the demand for it. There's not that much. In many cultures, people are not really used to eating, say, mussels at really large scale, unless you're Belgian and you're really going for those moule frites. But and the replacing like a regular piece of fish or meat with shellfish isn't necessarily an easy transition, and it's been interesting to see that this is anecdotal from the Netherlands, where the Dutch government was really interested in producing more bivalves and seaweed as a part of sort of ecosystem restoration, but then they didn't really think at all about what is going to be needed on the demand side of things. So I think there's been a lot of investment on the production side and not that much attention to what are we actually going to do with these products.
Well, yes, and this brings me back to one of the fundamentals that we are talking here today, and that's diversity in all its aspects. If you look at the transformation of the food system, still today, when we are focused just on the production systems, as Michel is saying, but there is so much. We just look at fast foods and how and the role that fast food is now playing in diets of all population groups, rural, young, old, all population groups. So there's a much work we can do by shaping the food environment and shaping what consumers would like to eat and why they would like to eat this. And it doesn't begin now. It begins with, it's a lifelong journey about how children, what they are taught in school, what the lifelong experiences and knowledge, where they build up habits that last them a lifetime. So it's much more complicated than that. But one thing I would say is that when we look when we are working in areas like this, we should look at the whole, at a holistic food systems approach. We should be context specific with the populations with which we work and the diversity of solutions that we have, not just for today, but solutions that last through a lifetime.
Yeah, of course. I think that's a great point. And, we could dig in for an hour on just the demand side challenge and changing consumer behavior and what does that look like and the behavior change psychology around, especially seafood, which is already tricky with an average consumer, I know from my experience. I want to unpack another concept that's in there and throw it to the panel and anyone jump in on it. Especially with the data that we heard from Michelle about shifting stocks, what's happening on the water, these fishing communities, literally some of them, the rug is being pulled out from underneath them. And so there has to be a plan B as part of a just transition and impact these communities and giving them some other way to make a livelihood and to Shakuntala's point is provide them with the nutrition that they need, which is critical. I'm wondering any feedback on or reaction to strategies you've seen out there to start to provide a plan B for these fishing communities, especially where legacy stocks are not going to be there in 10 years. Anyone? You want?
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, there's been a lot of talk around seaweed, different varieties of seaweed that can be used either in animal feed or that can be used for various
Human consumption.
What's that?
Human consumption.
Yeah, for human consumption. I mean, there's all sorts of applications which I've seen along coastal areas where different varieties grow quite effectively. But I don't know what that does in terms of their replacement of nutrients that they would otherwise be sourcing.
Well,
I mean, in some cases, I suppose it enhances it.
well, seaweed is a superfood,
Sure.
both for humans and for animals. So I mean, and there's a lot of focus now on seaweed, not just as a food, but also as a biofuel, and also as an animal feed. In reduction of methane. When you ask me that question, I would say if you look at many communities, take the west coast of Africa, where a lot of the fishing just outside of the coastal zone is being done by private companies, international fleets, and this fish goes into animal feeds to production systems in other countries. What if we find ways to make this fish, diverse aquatic foods that are caught, available to communities and to the countries and to these communities so that you can have other uses, other ways of using it that benefits the country and benefits the country both in terms of, vitally for me, in terms of food and nutrition, but also in terms of livelihoods. So it's not just one moving here and the other moving there. It has to be also holistic solutions that take into consideration governance, rights, the principles of rights, and the principles of equity and justice.
Yeah, just a quick comment, and we'll take another question on that. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there's this layer on top of this, right, of international fisheries management and law, who owns the sea, who owns the fish, that is very different and more complex than terrestrial farming, where it's very clear who owns that plot of land and the productivity that comes off of it. So there's a layer here. Tasneem, I think you have a question.
I have a comment which hopefully can translate into some form of a question, but I do think the point about traceability and giving small subsistence farmers more power is quite critical in allowing more diversification of what actually comes from the sea and maybe more sustainably sourced aquatic life. So there's some technology that does exist that does this. There's a company in South Africa that's now expanded across the world actually that does traceability from you can go to a restaurant, eat fish, and you know exactly who caught your fish. And I think there's some solutions that exist, and I don't know if it maybe applies in the regions that you live, but potentially I'd love to also hear your thoughts on how do you take that traceability and also then empower people, and then hopefully add more diversification in what's landing up on plates, because you're also giving more power to the subsistence farmers themselves.
Yeah, thank you. I believe the company, that's Abelobi, right? Yeah. And there's a couple of examples like that of these digital platforms that are empowering fishers or fish farmers to get more information, connect with consumers. And it's been quite successful in a number of regions. And yeah, this is where I'd be really curious to hear from the investment and the innovation side what their thoughts are on maintaining diversity within this process. So we've seen that, you know, the vast trends in aquaculture, for instance, a lot of the research and innovation has been in rich countries in salmon farming, and in low-income countries more on tilapia farming. And it's really great to have that kind of attention in the sense that it can increase efficiencies, it can you can really focus on certain outcomes that you want to achieve, but at the same time, you're really homogenizing the food system. And diversity, I think, is hard to grapple with from an innovation or an investment perspective. What you really need is, you know, I mean, currently, I would say that the most diverse aquatic food systems are small-scale producers who are pulling all sorts of different fish, shellfish, snails, frogs, whatever, out of the water and getting it to their local communities. And what is sort of the innovation or investment that can actually help that kind of diversity reach market, be supported? Is it cold chain? Is it markets? Is it infrastructure? I don't know what is needed, and how do you think from that?
Yeah, but at the same time, Michelle, you can have diversity in aquaculture, which we don't have, and this is something we should be working towards. And not just aquaculture. I mean, if you're looking at the food systems and you want to transform the food systems, if you go to farmers, especially small-scale farmers, low-income countries, there's no one with a pond who at the same time doesn't have land on which they grow vegetables and fruit. So we are looking at the whole food systems and not just one part of the production system.
I mean, the success of the green revolution, what we're really talking about is it alternatively is creating a blue revolution, right? And I think unfortunately, coming back to the example that you raised, it's really about scalability. I mean, our biggest challenge right now is that we just have this burgeoning global population that we're trying to feed. And, you know, as I mentioned to Robert earlier, I mean, the real solution is probably just to reduce the global population. But of course, that's not an option right now. So I think in reality, we need to continue to look at ways to scale our production so that we can continue to effectively feed the world. And so, again, coming all the way back to my initial point, I think one of the areas that we need to look at is, first of all, who's consuming what. I think when you're talking about on the west coast of Africa, or if, you know, we're talking about, you know, the south coast of Vietnam or something like that, I mean, these are big population centers, but they're not eating anywhere near per capita what people in the north are typically eating, right? So I think first of all, we need to look at what people in the north are consuming and find out whether or not we can educate people, taking into consideration nutritional density, which you touched on. But I think it's a really, really relevant topic, and it really does fit in this discussion. We just don't have the time. But I think we need to look more and more and more at how we're using these ingredients. Are we using them as a center of the plate solution? Is that essential, or are we using them as ingredients? If you're making a fish curry, for example, do you really care whether Carrie's made it in a factory or whether it's been caught when Carrie first started a number of years ago, she started with a product called fish maw, which is like a slurry, a fish slurry, and it's got multiple applications in the Chinese market. It's fantastic because it doesn't need structure, it can grow quickly, and it addresses problems that frankly most of us don't even know about. That the entire sort of East Asian market might know about it, which is an enormous market, I might add. But I mean, it's a solution that can be done, that can be readily developed using cultured means, and it solves a problem. And it solves a problem that we don't need to then go out into the seas and harvest all of these creatures in order to solve for. And so, I mean, let's look at where the ingredients play a part. How can we encourage or educate chefs and consumers to start looking at consuming some of these non-center of the plate products as really adequate replacements. And then that calls into account, the nutritional density, because if you look at things like plant-based foods and stuff, there's been a lot of discussion around whether or not they have an adequate nutritional density, whether or not they're introducing new problems into the food system that we don't already know about. So I think we need to address them together, but at the same time, I really think you're either looking at very, very high value product, or you're looking at ingredient type solutions that help to reduce our insatiable demand on what's coming from the seas, or even from aquaculture. I just don't think we can get there.
Well, that stems back also to the point we were making about diversity of population groups. Also within countries, if you take, even if you take a country like Bangladesh, there's a vast differences between the amount of aquatic foods that's consumed by the poor as compared to the rich. The same in Vietnam,
Yeah.
or any country. So we also have to look at that, those differences, and we may have our solutions have to be different for the different population groups. Perhaps one way we haven't talked about is nudging richer consumers to eat less aquatic foods.
Yeah.
And focusing on the value of aquatic foods for nutrition and health on other population groups. So it's that those nuances are very difficult to deal with, but we need to work with the nuances in order to find the solutions that will fit us today and also in the future. So, and there are movements now with respect to the push for sustainable, healthy diets in different population groups, and the solutions that are there for different population groups, and what kinds of nudging and information and solutions fit the better off as compared to poorer population groups. So, not one solution that fits all.
Very complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there is no silver bullet. I think that's clear, and that's cultural context is going to be very relevant here. Carrie, I want to give you a chance to come back to the topic on nutritional density, and especially looking at micronutrients and like the health benefits of fatty acids that are in seafood, and sort of what your feedback is on that in terms of your potential and your technology to help deliver those, both in maybe a whole cut in the future, but also potentially as an ingredient that could be added to a plant-based product or something to deliver the health benefits without needing to and the flavor that allows consumers to actually desire the product.
Right. So that touch on a little bit more technical aspect of the whole thing, right? Because when we culture the cells, we culture at the moment, we may still do some co-culturing, but basically, by default, it's actually culturing cell type by cell type. So muscle cell, fat cell, connective tissues, and things like that. So if you can consider that, like when you have a piece of conventional meat, be it fish or pork, it comes with everything pre-mixed in the proportion. And so now we're actually making the different parts, like different cells, separately, and then one way or the other combine them together. So in a way that it can actually have a benefit that we can actually customize the nutritional profile of the final product if we wish. If we want it to be leaner, then we have less fat cells. If we want it to be fatter, of course, we could introduce more. So I think that is something viable. In terms of the benefit, health benefit, of course, using the cell cultivation method is that we don't expose to the pollutants in the ocean, namely no heavy metal, microplastic, etc. So I think from the nutrition and food safety angle, there are multiple advantages using this new method as well.
Thanks for that. I want to come back to a topic that Shakuntala brought up that I think is so important. One of my big frustrations working in seafood was the amount of forage fish that we destroy in the ocean only to then feed to fish for farming. And your point was, what if we could repurpose these for actual human nutrition? But in order to do that, we would have to offset the demand for fish feed. And we've spent a lot of time talking about nutrition and food for humans, but let's shift for a minute and talk about, innovative ways that we can feed aquaculture fish. I know that there's a lot of things going on. In particular, I want to start with you, Shakuntala. I think World Fish is involved in an experiment looking at using insects for aquaculture, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, not only World Fish, I mean, this is a movement that has been there for a long while, and it's just not insects for animal feed, but insects also as human food. So yes, I do think the research shows us that there's great potential, but much more has to be done. And again, the scalability of this and where you want to need to use it. But I want to go back to the point you made before about the companies or the nations that fish the oceans for fish which they then use for producing animal feed. Just think if we had a better governance systems, and we talked about how much fish that's taken from the waters of countries that should be landed in that country and be used for human consumption. Just imagine if we had governance systems where we can have some of that fish used in the country, for example, in school feeding programs or in mother and child health programs. And those, I don't see that as being difficult instruments to put in place, but you have to begin with governance, and you have to begin with principles of rights of people and leaving no one behind. So.
No better place to discuss that than at COP, right? Yeah.
Can I follow up a bit on your feed question? So I think the insects you're referring to is black soldier fly larvae. And then there's all sorts of other innovations. I think people are working with duckweed. People are working with repurposing more food loss and waste into fish feed products. But one sort of interesting development that I wanted to highlight was that there's now stories emerging of, as there's pressure on companies to reduce the carbon footprint of their supply chains, they are also trying to reduce the carbon footprint associated with feed. And so one major source of carbon emissions coming out of feed is that the fact that a lot of companies now use soy and corn and all those other kinds of terrestrial products into their feed. And soy in particular is associated with a lot of deforestation, so it can be high carbon emissions. So we're seeing some companies move to, instead of using soy, they're switching back to fish meal and fish oil as an ingredient in their feed because it will help them meet their carbon reduction targets. And so this is where I think it's really important that we are clear about what do and do we not want to happen when it comes to reducing carbon emissions, and that we need a broader set of sustainability indicators when it comes to our feed, and not that a sole focus on carbon isn't going to get us there, because I think we really want to avoid a situation where we get low carbon feed and it means we are exclusively using fish meal and fish oil from the oceans.
Low carbon, high biodiversity loss.
Yes, exactly.
So, which comes back to this conversation of what's the nexus of climate and biodiversity. Before we move on, Kim, I wanted to give you a chance to respond about this idea of novel feeds for aquaculture and what potential you see as an investor.
Well, it's interesting because you and I talked about this, Robert, as well. When I was involved with the seafood company, the fish farmers themselves, or the shrimp farmers themselves, were really at the mercy of the feed companies, because the feed companies actually helped them to finance each new wave of production. And so really, from a scale perspective, again, coming back to that term, I think the big challenge is you're talking about inputs that maybe aren't all that scalable. I mean, they're preferable, but they're not scalable. And so, again, coming back to our conversation around seaweeds, there's varieties of seaweed that actually reduce some of their antidotes to pathogens and things like that. So they reduce the antibiotics that are required in the ponds and things like that. So there are a lot of really interesting, novel ingredients that can be used for seafood. And what I think is particularly interesting about this is that not only are they serving the nutritional side, but they're also addressing some of the antibiotics and things like that. So as you look at it, the challenge here is to look at the combination of the two. And so from a producer's perspective, if they're looking purely at feed and a feed replacement and they're not taking into consideration the antibiotics, they'll say, wow, this is too expensive. But if you look at the inclusion value, then you can start to price that product in, and it becomes a very effective replacement. But then it comes back to, are we growing an adequate amount of variety of seaweed to actually create a sustainable supply chain? So it's a very, very interesting space, and I think there's a lot more to be done there, and it's an area that I'm particularly interested in. But yeah, again, it's all about scalability in the financing side, unfortunately.
Anyone else have a question that they wanted to ask? You got one more?
One of the main things I learned in COP is the word intersectionality. So basically, things are way more connected, and sometimes it's not that obvious the benefit that can come from changing, being brave. I heard a lot of focus on the word ingredients. Ingredients lead us to something like Banana Republic and all of the situation with it, soya. So I would like to replace that focus on environment, ecosystems, because you really need to take the whole reality together. One thing I would love to suggest is that potentially, if you understand that there is a lot of money, let's say concrete is a big industry, 40% of the concrete can be used replacing calcium carbonate from eggshells or oyster shells. Sounds better now?
No, I completely agree. I mean, I understand the argument that you're making. The problem is that what we're really trying to do is, first and foremost, we're trying to feed people. Unfortunately. I mean, that's why we're in the situation we're in today. If we had thought about all of those externalities, all those other sort of unintended consequences along the way, perhaps we wouldn't be where we are today, but we are where we are. And we still have that requirement to feed people. And so balancing some of the kinds of issues that Dr. Tilstead is mentioning, for example, in looking at more subsistence type communities and things like that. I mean, balancing the needs of those communities with, let's say, the richer, more heavily consuming economies of the north, let's say, that north-south dichotomy that we're starting to hear more and more about. I think it's incumbent upon the north to sort of change their habits. But unfortunately, as they change their habits, we need to continue to feed them, right? So, and when I look at the challenge that I face as a financer of these kinds of activities, to be honest, I could get very cynical very quickly because the issues that I care about don't always necessarily align with the kind of returns that our funders are expecting. And so I think that's where governments have a role to play. And when we talk about sort of the tragedies of the commons or the fact that coastal communities can only go so far from their coastline and have control over their fisheries, those are a shame. And yes, we should change those dynamics, but the reality is those really fall outside the control of this room here, and certainly outside the control of financiers like ourselves. So these are really more policy-related issues that, frankly, hopefully, organizations like COP are helping to address. But as it comes straight back to sort of looking at, I completely agree with you that increasingly we need to look at with a broader lens at many of the things that we're doing, sort of along the lines of looking at seaweed not only as a feed but also as a reducer of antibiotics. That the combination of the two allow it to be cost effective. If you take them one at a time, it's not a cost-effective solution. So similar to your point about concrete and things like that, I mean, I think still there needs to be a demand for the oysters that you're talking about creating in the first place, not just for concrete, but also for consumption.
Tomato was considered poisoning until people realized that it's good. Then you have pizza.
Yeah, there you go. Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure we're on the same side. The question is, how do we pitch it in ways that help to attract sufficient capital and political and social support, and change consumers' behavior. I mean, all those things. It's a challenge.
There's a couple more topics I want to address quickly before we run out of time, and I wanted to, one is come back to the problem that is common for COP, is that at the end of the day, the global north is responsible for a lot of the problem that we have, and we have this incredible fixation on tuna, salmon, and shrimp, and the demand is off the charts, and I'm wondering, like, just quick fire, what each of you might think about ways that we can address or offset that demand. Is it encouraging utilization of other wild-caught species and innovations like carries, et cetera? I'm sure it's something that you've thought about. You don't have to go first. Anybody can jump in.
Carrie's got the business case for it. So.
Well, so I believe that actually consumer behavior is pretty rigid in the short term, but actually quite flexible in the long term. There are a lot of examples, like, for example, avocado or quinoa. We did not know about this food maybe a couple of decades ago, is from a certain part of the world, and now they're basically everywhere. So I believe that with clever and campaign and marketing, think about like avocado, you can say that, okay, it's actually quite tasty, but quinoa is no flavor at all, but then the clever campaign is a superfood, and so you find it in salad everywhere. So I think in the past, we have actually been commercializing and campaigning and actually selling certain species, right? But then as we go along, as we can do it, we can actually also market some other kind of thing. But I think what we need to do in the shifting consumer behavior, this is one aspect. The other, from where we operate in cellular culture or something, need the consumer behavior to change a little bit sooner. I would like to, hopefully on the COP kind of platform, explore what are the incentive system, or a system that can discourage not so sustainable and kind of like consumption pattern there. So I think these are the 2 points we'd like to address from the question.
I do think, unfortunately, there are, to have robust solutions and long-term solutions, many of this take time. And I agree with you that consumer behavior is important, but important in changing consumer behavior. It's long-term, it's education and knowledge. And I do think with youth and the roles that we are seeing now that youth are playing in transformation of food systems, both in consumer behavior, but also if you look at how they have been engaging with supply chains and production systems during COVID and the new solutions that they have been putting in use. I do think there are many ways that we can move forward and get better solutions than what we have today.
And maybe
we need to get away from shrimp tacos to the mollusk tacos.
Yeah, maybe just to build on the aspect of youth, I think blue foods are quite unique in the sense that people eat them, at least in the Western world, people tend to eat them out a lot more than they cook them at home. And so that also means that there is a lot of actors involved that can actually change demand and showcase different examples of different kinds of blue foods that might be to contribute to sort of the long-term type of dietary shifts that Carrie was pointing at with her strong opinions on the flavor of quinoa. But I'd say, so in terms of retailers, restaurants, procurement processes, but then also the social safety type, net type things like school meals and these other more larger scale procurement processes are excellent ways in which we can think about diversifying demand for blue foods that do not necessarily involve immediately teaching people how to cook bivalves or other types of aquatic foods at home.
Thank you for that. I always want to end on a hopeful note. So 20 seconds each. What gives you hope right now about taking on this challenge?
For me, it would definitely be the availability of public funding. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, if we don't have adequate sort of funding that's not specifically aligned to short timelines, like say venture capital, and that funding a lot of times comes hand in hand with policy initiatives as well. So I think that's really encouraging, because ultimately that's what's going to make the difference. I mean, that kind of funding and those kinds of policy initiatives.
I think for cellular culture, I think our prayers back a few years ago kind of partly answered by Singapore government and US FDA. More to come, but I think in addition to the funding, I think we need a bit more other like carrot and stick kind of like a policy or system to advocate or encourage consumer to change the behavior a little bit, because without those pressure by individual kind of goodwill, I think it would just take too long.
I do think investments, but also investments in data and technologies. If you look at the diversity of aquatic foods, there is so little we know about it, and there is so little that we have embraced about the diversity in the aquatic foods. So there's much more we can do that. And as I said before, I really do think that consumer behavior, environmental factors can play a large role, and you know, looking to youth to make incremental changes very soon.
For me, maybe a bit of a more nerdy one, but I am just really excited to see the rise of food in spaces like the UNFCCC. For the longest time, it was really focused on energy, fossil fuels, and now tomorrow we'll have the first ever food day. And in parallel, we've really seen the rise of the ocean agenda within UNFCCC. So hopefully soon these two can meet, and we can have aquatic foods firmly into these kind of formal negotiation processes, but also have that through things like the global stocktake, then trickle down into what countries put into their nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, and translate that into change on the ground.
Yeah, I totally agree. Holding them accountable for the promises that have been made here is our next task, right? So I want to thank you all. Incredible panel, incredible discussion. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.